been reported that Jeremy Corbyn is going to join a South African delegation, which is making moves to designate Israel's military campaign in Gaza as genocide. Now, this is a very controversial thing because genocide has a very specific legal definition, namely, and very basically speaking, the deliberate attempt to eradicate a group of people, a specific group of people, usually based on racial characteristics. That's basically the definition of genocide. Now, before I continue with this video, I want to be very clear. I am not someone who just blindly agrees with everything Israel does. I have said before, I am uneasy with the way this war is being conducted. I think the aerial campaign in particular has clearly caused a lot of civilian casualties, and I think some statements by Israeli IDF spokespeople have been absurd, claiming that there's no humanitarian crisis or trying to downplay this. Without question, Israel's campaign has caused heavy civilian casualties, and I've said before that a Palestinian child should be seen in equal terms to an Israeli child. There's no, that shouldn't be a moral maze. That should be straightforward, really. But I also maintain that this conflict, this latest flare-up, this very major flare-up, that began in October 2023, was started by Hamas. That's a reality. Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023. They brutally killed hundreds of civilians. They kidnapped people. Many of those hostages have still not been released. That's a reality. Now, you could say, of course, this is a long running conflict and there's lots of other background issues. But specifically, this war, I don't know what the war is going to be known as, 2023 war, or, previous conflicts have been given names like the Yom Kippur War, the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, same conflict, and so on. But I guess the 2023 Israel-Gaza war. But it was started by Hamas. Now, why does that matter? It matters because when you're charging a country with genocide, I don't think any significant legal proceedings have happened so far, but that's a very serious allegation. Now, why is South Africa doing it? Who knows? I think South Africa, the ANC, it's a left-wing political party. It's always been on the left of geopolitics, so that shouldn't be overly surprising that they would be pro-Palestinian. I think South Africa, I see some similarities with India. I think that part of it is just will be different from whatever the West is doing. And unfortunately, India has been taking that position as well. Officially, India is neutral on issues like Ukraine, but if there's any opportunity to show, we'll be different from the West, they will take it. And I question that as a foreign policy strategy. In the Cold War, it was called sort of non-aligned, but more often than not, non-aligned translated as appeasing dictatorships. I'm pretty skeptical of it. But, regardless of why South Africa's doing this, what I want to talk about is Jeremy Corbyn, the former British politician. Now, well, I say former, he's still politically active. He's no longer in the Parliamentary Labour Party. I want to talk a little bit about Corbyn because, in theory, he should be yesterday's man, but a bit like Donald Trump, he's a stink that keeps coming back. Now, listen to Corbyn's supporters, and their attitude is he's a thoroughly decent man, he's motivated by compassion, he's the only honest person in Westminster, and it's just this, gushing praise. Well, I look at his record, and yes, on the domestic front, there are some areas where he had some refreshing positions. He publicly spoke out, for example, against the way welfare recipients were treated. There were some areas like that, I could have got on board. But for me, what was so repellent about Corbynism was its far left worldview. its anti-West worldview. And Jeremy Corbyn has never, in public life, defended British national interests. Never. This is a man who has always, always either appeased or outright taken the side of our adversaries every time. And this is a man with a track record of supporting left-wing dictatorships. That's a fact. That's his record. So for Corbyn to jump on this bandwagon and accuse Israel of genocide, I think, like I say, some of the things Israel's doing, it's causing a lot of civilian casualties. But in order to accuse it of an act, to be engaging in genocide, well, I've said that Israel has to be careful not to look like it's engaging in collective punishment. But if Israel wanted to engage in an act of genocide, it's a lot more powerful than Gaza is. It could have done it by now. It could have, this notion that it wants to just kill everyone in Gaza, it would have done it by now. If that was the intention. But that's a very, very serious charge. I think in its military campaign, too many civilians have died. Israel's allies have spoken out about this. I'm pleased to say. I'm critical of Netanyahu. I think he has bolstered some far-right elements in Israel, like far-right settlers. But this is the thing, this vilification of the state of Israel and Israeli people. Some of the biggest critics of Netanyahu are Israelis. Don't forget, before this war broke out, there were big protests in Israel against Netanyahu. So, people vilifying the Israelis should bear that in mind. But I do question this unique focus on Israel. Thousands have died. It's a very serious situation. But you know what? Hundreds of thousands have died in the Syrian civil war. Now, those who are condemning Israel today, I question how many of them condemn Bashar Assad as he was raining barrel bombs on children in Syria. And I remember, that war is far from over, incidentally. It's kind of taken a backseat in the news, but far from over. I remember how disgusted I was seeing Russian media indoctrination or Russian state propaganda in favour of Assad. And it was repulsive. And the narrative was basically, this is an embattled leader fighting against terrorists. Well, Putin has used Islamist factions to fight in Ukraine. So for him to lecture the West about supporting Islamist terrorists is absurd. I think the Western position on Syria, if you look at it, we took military action against Assad and Islamic State. The truth is, it's a very, very messy, very bloody war. And the reality of the matter is, Islamic State got traction after China and Russia vetoed action against Assad. Islamic State took advantage of the quagmire. But if you want to believe conspiracy theories and believe the Russian narrative, the West created Islamic State. Or, if you look at the film Vice about former Vice President Dick Cheney, it kind of ends with these absurd conclusions. I think Adam Mackay is trying to be the new Oliver Stone. I have a really big problem with this worldview that seeks to blame the West first and only. And yeah, patriotism comes into it, but it's more than that, and more important than that, it's a distortion. It's just a distortion. The truth of the matter is, Jeremy Corbyn is a human rights hypocrite. This is a man who will pontificate and, talk about how awful, Israel is and the Israeli policy is. But he won't have a thing to say about Putin's human rights abuses. Of course he'll say he doesn't support Putin. And he may even bring himself to condemn some of the human rights issues in Russia, just about. But consider the record. Jeremy Corbyn was the chairman of the Stop the War Coalition. Now, the Stop the War Coalition, supposedly a pacifist organisation, was basically pro-Assad during the Syrian war. I think it's a vulgar organisation. It first came to my attention during the Iraq War, and I thought it was just okay, well, it's an anti-war group. And, I was against that war. I still think it was a foreign policy disaster. But over time, I realised the Stop the War coalition, it's a pacifist organisation that basically serves as a bunch of cheerleaders for Arab dictators like Assad. As long as they're anti-West, they'll condemn the Saudis because Saudi Arabia is pro-West, or we have, much better relations with the Saudis. Still a terrible human rights record, but this is what I find so repulsive about the lecturing left. I mean, the difference where you get with the hard right is they don't really pretend to care about human rights. They will openly say they support torture and so on. With the left, there's hypocrisy there. The hypocrisy is more glaring because they do pontificate on human rights in a way that the hard right doesn't necessarily in the same way. I think there's hypocrites on both sides. But, I mean, you could point to, for example, the fact that Thatcher was cosy with Pinochet, and she was, and that's a stain on her record. But, when I look at Jeremy Corbyn, I see a man who has appeased Vladimir Putin, supported Assad essentially through the Stop the War coalition, openly support Castro, or gushed eulogies on him when he died. Definitely support the Maduro and Chavez regimes in Venezuela, a completely failed state. And I dread to think what the situation would be if in 2019 or 2017 Corbyn got into power. I think the UK would sort of stand out like a sore thumb among Western democracies, and I think we would be at this point, if not supporting Russia, definitely appeasing Russia. And that turns my stomach. I have many, many disagreements with this Conservative government, but at least on foreign policy, they've got it right regarding Ukraine. And that's something I think has been consistent in the last three administrations, and I think something that Starmer recognises as well. For all Starmer's pandering to the woke left, one area I'm not concerned about is in foreign policy. I think Starmer's solid there. I have no concerns about that. This is something that he has detoxified the Labour Party in. If Jeremy Corbyn got into power, we would have had a Prime Minister who had a far-left worldview, and that's never happened in British history. Sure, in the 70s, Harold Wilson was accused of being a KGB spy. It never really transpired to anything. But, I mean, had Corbyn got into number 10, we would have a Putin appeaser in power. We would have someone who has praised communist tyrants. And that turns my stomach. I mean, think of the Conservative equivalent. Think if a Conservative Prime Minister had praised some far-right neo-Nazi leader. I mean, yes, I mentioned Thatcher and Pinochet, but let's give a more glaring example. If you'd had a Conservative Prime Minister who'd praised the Nazis, I mean, I do think that would be the equivalent. You have a far-left leader in Corbyn who has praised communist tyrants. So what's the difference? What's the moral difference, really? It's both forms of totalitarianism, both responsible for tens of millions of deaths. But we could get into a numbers game, but the point here is to play this pontificating on human rights and yet have a track record that speaks otherwise. Sure, when it comes to left-wing causes, I mean, I've no doubt Corbyn has, went to anti-racism concerts. I'm sure he was in the anti-apartheid campaign. That's all good. That's fine. But what I cannot accept is the hypocrisy of being in all those campaigns, worthy as they are, and yet turning a blind eye to human rights abuses when it comes to left-wing dictatorships. And I've seen this in other figures. I won't name the person in this video, but I know a sort of someone who is, again, very left-wing figure, and he's always preaching about human rights. And yet when Castro died, he was full of praise. Rest well, comrade, and stuff like this, and it made me sick. When it comes to Putin, incidentally, we see appeasement of by both the far left and the far right for different reasons. The far left tend to appease Putin um, because they're skeptical of the power of NATO and issues around that. The hard right tend to appease Putin because who knows, they see Putin as being for conservative values or something. God knows what perverse reason they have for doing so. But this is the sick thing. Corbynites in Britain and Trump supporters in America have more in common than they think. Um, and I think we're living in a time in 2024 where liberal democracies are facing a real test. And I think all of those of us who believe in liberal democracy and are against totalitarianism in all its forms, whether far left or far right, we can't be complacent because I think it's on the rise. Nationalistic populism is rising around the world. This year, almost 4 billion people will go to the polls. So I think we're at not a turning point, but I think we're at a very interesting juncture of where the world is heading. Now, in terms of getting back to the issue I was talking about, these genocide charges against Israel, I think there should be pressure on Israel to reduce civilian casualties, but the charge of genocide is a very, very specific one. And I would raise the question, why is Israel singled out? Why did South Africa, if they're so concerned about genocide, why did they not raise this when Bashar Assad was raining barrel bombs on children? Because it's Bashar Assad in Syria. Doesn't involve Israel. I think that among the world's hard left, there is if not a naked anti-Semitism, there is this fixation with the state of Israel. Israel gets condemned for things that other states have done and done far worse. And that's not to say that Israel cannot be criticised. That's never been my position. And by the way, I don't say that if someone criticises Israel, they're an anti-Semite. There's Israelis who criticise Israel. There's left-wing Jewish people who criticise Israel. But I do say that if there is a unique criticism of Israel, if Israel is singled out for vilification, whilst so many other dictatorships get ignored, I have a big problem with that. And I do question the ideology of those who push that narrative. I mean, Pakistanis who burn the Israeli flag whilst ignoring what China does to the Uyghur people, that's incredible because China's on their doorstep, literally, borders Pakistan to the north. So why is it okay to attack Israel for perceived injustices against the Palestinians, but you're turning a blind eye to China's mass incarceration of the Uyghur Muslims? It's is it for trade reasons? Is it? I don't know. Um, but I think that there is obvious double standards there. Um, but when I think of this stuff, I'm just so relieved that Corbyn didn't get into power. Unfortunately, there are people in this country, quite a lot of them. I wouldn't put guess on numbers, but there is still quite a lot of people who buy into that Corbyn myth that he's just this kind, compassionate guy who just want the best for British society. Jeremy Corbyn is a far left ideologue with a far left worldview, and I basically think some of his positions are treacherous. I'm going to say it. I believe that's the case. Um, for human rights, I mean, I don't see how you can praise communist dictators whilst your supporters claim that you're for human rights. It's just a contradiction. I'd say the same about conservatives who preach about human rights, but they turn a blind eye to right-wing dictatorships. I'd say the same thing. But I think that, yeah, that's the obvious thing that you see with this sort of ideology.